With the presidential election coming up, there's a lot of talk about how that's going to affect the stock market. What should we do with our portfolios? That's going to be our topic on today's episode of Friends Talk Financial Planning. Hi, I'm John Shear, and I run a fee-only financial planning practice in Middleton, Wisconsin.
And I'm Bridget Sullivan-Mermel. I've got a family financial planning practice in Chicago, Illinois. John, before we get into elections in your portfolio, please subscribe. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, which is a benchmark that 90% of YouTubers don't get. So we're trying to get there, and you can help by just hitting subscribe. All right, John, let's talk elections and the stock market. What is your first point on this topic?
Yeah, it's interesting that midterm elections, we don't get too many questions about that. But every 4 years, when the presidential election comes up, we tend to have a lot of conversations with clients about what's going on and sort of how to think about it, right? And of course, people have their own different views on, who should or shouldn't get elected. But the underlying question that I get anyway from folks is, what do we do about this, right? What do we do if this person gets elected or if that party gets elected, right? What happens and how do we think about that? And one of the things that can be really difficult with these sort of decisions, I think, Bridget, is how it feels, right? Like, oh, I think these folks are good for the country, for the economy. I feel bad because it's kind of personal to us, right? When we're voting for who we want to represent our interests. And it feels like that should translate into our investments. But I mean, when you take a look back at the data, that's the other thing that I talk about really is getting into the data, like what actually has happened? What does it actually look like? And that separation of facts and feelings is really, I think, useful to take a look at.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the rhetoric can get so extreme that it seems that if the other party wins the presidential election, everything will fall off a cliff, and it can be. I think they're doing that to motivate people to act, but for some people, that's kind of a lot of stress to take, and they
That's right.
can't that's stressful. And I wish they wouldn't do that, first of all, but it's really to motivate people to act. And it can be hard to sort out, okay, what are the probabilities here of things falling off a cliff? And geez, they haven't in the past. So uh that's the best thing. It helps me sleep at night.
Yeah.
However, that's what we're going to be looking at. It's like, okay, well, what has happened in the past? During elections. So
One of
let's
the
get
things
to.
that I learned from you in one of our past episodes was talking about tax law changes, right? And we hear these things a lot, and it ties in to the election is back in 2000 when the election came and the Democrats had both the White House and then Congress as well. One of the campaign pledges was, or one of the promises was changing the estate tax law. And how do we do that? And geez, and here's these things that come and it can affect a lot of regular people. Back when I first started doing this, 100 years ago, or at least in the last century, maybe not 100 years ago, it just feels like that. But, we had a lot of regular folks that were subject to the estate tax. We had to do some kind of planning around that, right? It's not unrealistic. And then that was the campaign promise, and here's what our platform is. But then reality, right, can be so much different. And I remember you saying, well, listen, we'll deal with it when the new laws get passed. And here we are, 3.5 years later, not much in the way of those new laws from a tax standpoint on estate taxes. And I think it's the exact same thing that you're talking about is, hey, let's look at the facts here. And we'll bring up a slide here that just shows going back from the most recent election down, we're going back 100 years, right? In different presidential terms, like what happens. And in blue, of course, are the Democratic presidents, and in red are the Republican presidents. And what has the S&P 500 done over that time period? You can see on the top right there, a little over 10%, right? Market averages 10% over a long period of time. But you can see those numbers, and I'm always interested. I'll ask clients, or people I talk with, well, what pattern do you see in there? I'm curious to your answer. What's the pattern you see in that?
See a pattern. If I see a pattern, it's especially if you take Roosevelt into account at the bottom, like blue seems to be better, but they don't talk about that, and they don't seem to. That seems to not be what the blue says.
You don't
And
see a
like,
pattern in that?
are we really going to take Roosevelt? Like Obviously, we do, the Democrats do consider him, but I mean, it was a pretty complicated situation.
Yeah, yeah. But it's interesting. I'll say, you don't see a pattern in there, really? I mean, what pattern should I say? Like, yeah, there is no pattern, right?
Right.
Here's the pattern that I see when I take a look at this is, so of course that center line is zero, right? So anything to the left
Right.
of there is negative returns over that particular 4-year period. To the right is positive returns. In looking at that, I see 3, maybe 4 lines that are negative. And I didn't add up the number. How many elections are though? 20 or 25 elections? I guess if we go back 100 years, it'd be 25 probably, right? So you have 4 out of 25, right? Are negative, and that means all the other years presidential terms are positive. So if I'm going to make a guess as to what happens, whoever gets elected here this November is there. Looks like there's a pretty good chance, based on history, that the returns are positive,
Right.
right? I mean, and
And
again, what else is there to take from that sort of thing? And to your point of talking about, the Democrats certainly in the blue there certainly have a good track record of stock market returns during their presidencies. That's not the
right.
feeling or the impression. If you were just to say, ask me without taking a look at the data, well, which party has had more favorable returns? I wouldn't have said that necessarily, but you
Doesn't
take a
seem
look
like
and it
one of the
certainly.
Democratic talking points, but they don't seem to want to add it. I'm sure they know it's not for
Well,
whatever reason.
part of it is just that it's so random, right? And we didn't get into this, and we're not going to get into all the different factors. The presidential election gets the headlines, but what about Congress? What about all the other things that play into this? Is how impactful is a president or a Congress when they first take office versus their policies show up 5 or 10 years later? I mean, all these other things. It's not like, well, here's the answer. To me anyway, I'll say I'm interested to hear your take, but for me, the answer is it just doesn't make that much difference, right? One
No.
side versus the other side, and the impact that a president can have on things. Yep, not that there's no impact for sure, right? But not like, well, this person or this party gets in office and here's the direction. Number one, I don't see any real direction, difference between the two that it wouldn't be subject to or, explainable by just pure luck. And number two, that one side of the office, that handles like that doesn't drive all the economy or the stock market or all those things, even though it feels like it should, right? I want to know the answers to what happened. That's just not how it works in my
Well,
mind.
and some changes take longer, so I would say that the wall coming down helped the economy during the Clinton era. Well, okay, so do you give who do you give credit to that
Right,
for? And I don't think that the economy was the driving factor in wanting the wall to come down either. Like, oh, that's going to help our economy. It was just kind of a side effect. And
right,
just guess what? The internet was coming on board right at the same time too. So it could have been just all internet. Who knows?
right.
So there's a lot of there's so many different factors that it doesn't you can't pinpoint one. So I think also people want to know, what about this year? And what about this year and next year? So what do you got data for that?
Yeah, that's great. Let's pull up. There's another slide here that talks about exactly that. So one's like, all right, who do we want to get elected, right? And the answer is, I don't think it makes much difference. We'll pull up this slide here, and in the blue lines on this are the same data going back, 100 years with elections. What happens during the election year, and then what happens in the year following the election year are the green lines. And so let's just focus on the blue lines here. 2024, we're in an election year, right? And take a look. How many of those blue lines go to the left? There's a couple, 4, I guess, on there, right?
Yeah.
But again, most of the time, what happens during
Usually
election years? It's
right.
positive, right? So
Right.
do we know? I'm not going to predict, okay, here's what we think, but on average, typically, yep, we see positive returns. And for
Right.
me, the other takeaway is what happens in years after, right? So we have an election here in November. Next January, the president gets inaugurated, whoever that is. What happens then? And you take a look at those green lines. There's a lot more green lines that go to the left, right? So if I'm concerned about anything right now, maybe not so much during the election year, but what happens following that? And I'll give you the spoiler alert: is even in those following years, I think it's all white noise. I don't think we can predict things, but if anything, I'm not, that this information tells me not to worry about this year and probably not to worry about next year either, but more so next than this.
Right.
What's your take as you look at this?
Yeah, I would say, geez, it's actually a little better than I would have thought for the year during the election. But that we only, like, how many presidents we have? We have like a data set of like 20. That's not
And you're
enough to
right. Yeah.
really, that's not enough to create a really decent, significantly, statistically
Statistically
significant
significant.
average.
Right. Right.
I'm gonna add just tongue twisters to my daily habits. So yeah, it's just not enough data, I would say, to really form a big opinion about what's going to happen. And we've got one more slide too that just kind of, again, overall, what ends up happening is that the market typically marches higher,
Yeah.
and it's not it doesn't depend that much, or if at all, on the who's president, or who's the president,
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Right.
or what party affiliation they are. And there's another crosstab that has, who's in Congress, and they certainly, the politicians have some impact on the stock market, but exactly what it is, when it happens, etc., it's very difficult to predict.
Yeah.
But generally the stock market goes up. So having a well-diversified portfolio is what hits the spot.
That's right. That's my takeaway from it too, is we don't change things based on who, even if we knew who was going to be elected, we don't change the investment philosophy and our financial planning. To me, the elections, I'll say this to folks, the elections are very important for a lot of reasons, but your investments are not one of those reasons.
Very good.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I think with that's a great place to wrap it up. I'm Bridget Sullivan Mermel. I've got a fee-only financial planning practice in Chicago, Illinois.
And I'm John Shear. I've got a fee-only financial planning practice in Middleton, Wisconsin. Both Bridget and I are taking on new clients ourselves, but we're also both members of the Alliance of Comprehensive Planners. So if you like what you hear on our show and want to find an advisor in your local area, you can check out acplanners.org.
And please subscribe.